Let me take you back to Los Angeles in the mid-1980s. It was a city of contradictions. Sunshine and palm trees masking shadows of crime and corruption. Hollywood was booming. Freeways were crowded. And the LAPD was under constant pressure as gang violence and murder skyrocketed. But for one woman, Los Angeles represented opportunity, freedom, and a future she was just beginning to build. Her name was Sherri Rasmussen. Sherri was the kind of person people didn't just like. They admired her. Born in Loma Linda, California, she was raised in a loving and close-knit family. From an early age, she stood out. Intelligent, disciplined, compassionate. By the time she reached her 20s, she had already carved out a reputation as a natural leader. Sherri had a gift for healthcare. Her father once said she had a nurse's heart but a leader's mind. She pushed herself through nursing school, where her drive and determination set her apart. She wasn't content to just care for patients. She wanted to shape the system itself. By her late 20s, she had become the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. Think about that. While most of her peers were still figuring out their careers, Sherri was running entire departments. But she wasn't all business. Those who knew her described Sherri as warm, funny, quick to laugh, a woman with empathy that filled the room. She was the kind of person who made you feel like you mattered, no matter who you were. And then she met John. John Rutan was tall, athletic, and easygoing. He had gone to UCLA, played sports, and was well-liked by his peers. To friends, John was the kind of guy who seemed to have it all together. And when he and Sherri crossed paths in 1984, sparks flew. John was captivated, not just by her beauty, but by her intelligence, her drive, and her compassion. To Sherri, John was steady, reliable, kind. They balanced each other out. Sherri, the ambitious visionary. John, the grounded and calm partner. By 1985, the two were inseparable. Family and friends saw them as a perfect match. In November that year, they married in a beautiful ceremony. Pictures show them beaming with joy, the kind of smiles that light up their whole faces. Sherri often told people she had found her soulmate. But in stories like this, perfection never lasts. What Sherri didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that outside the frame of her new life lurked a shadow, a person who refused to let go of the past. Someone who had once been in John's life and wasn't willing to let him go so easily. In the months after the wedding, John and Sherri settled into their new home in Van Nuys, a quiet neighborhood in Los Angeles. Sherri threw herself into her work at the hospital, and John built his career in engineering. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of a lifelong love story. But Sherri began to notice something strange. Little things, unsettling things. Phone calls where the line went dead, a sense of being watched. And on more than one occasion, she confided in her parents that she felt uneasy. She told them she had a bad feeling that someone wasn't happy about her marriage to John. She didn't know how right she was. Because while Sherri was building a life of promise, someone else was quietly planning her destruction. And on a quiet February morning in 1986, that promise would be shattered forever. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss another deep dive into true crime mysteries. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. It's the mid-1980s in Los Angeles. The air is warm, the skyline smoggy but alive, and the city itself feels like it's racing toward the future. But beneath the surface, behind the palm trees and Hollywood glamour, there's a darker rhythm. The crime rate is climbing, gang violence is spreading, and the LAPD is stretched thin, struggling to keep the city from falling into chaos. This is the world where our story begins. And at the center of it all is a young woman named Sherri Rasmussen. Sherri wasn't just anybody. She was the kind of person who left an impression the moment she walked into a room. She was born in 1957, the eldest daughter of Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, a couple who believed in hard work, in faith, in family. From a young age, Sherri showed a sharp mind and a compassionate heart. She wasn't the kind of kid who waited for the world to come to her. She chased it. By her early 20s, Sherri had earned a nursing degree and quickly made a name for herself. Not only was she talented in her field, but she had the sort of leadership that made people take notice. At just 29 years old, she had already risen to become the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. Think about that for a second. At an age when most people are still figuring out their careers, Sherri was running departments, saving lives, and mentoring younger nurses. But Sherri wasn't only defined by her career. She was vibrant, athletic, outgoing. She loved playing volleyball. She loved her family deeply, and she carried herself with a confidence that was both graceful and magnetic. And in 1984, that confidence caught the eye of a man named John Rutan. John was handsome, easygoing, an engineer with a bright future. He and Sherri crossed paths, and sparks flew quickly. To friends and family, they seemed like the perfect couple, balanced in a way that made sense. Sherri was driven and ambitious. John was laid back, calm, and steady. They complemented each other. Within 2 years, they were married. For Sherri, life seemed to be falling into place. She had her dream job, a loving family, and now a husband she adored. It was the kind of life people dream about, the kind of future her parents had always hoped for her. But what Sherri didn't know was that not everyone was happy about this new chapter in her life. Because while she and John were building their future together, someone from John's past was watching. And that someone would change everything. It was February 24th, 1986, a Monday, the kind of morning that, for most people, passes without notice. The sun had just started to push through the haze over Los Angeles. Commuters were inching down freeways. Kids were heading off to school. For Sherri Rasmussen, it was supposed to be another day of leadership and responsibility at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. But Sherri had been restless. She wasn't feeling well that morning. Tired, worn down. Her husband John suggested she take the day off. And so, Sherri stayed home, wrapped in the comfort of the couple's townhouse in Van Nuys. What happened inside that townhouse in the hours that followed still sends chills down the spine. That evening, John Rutan returned home. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow through the blinds. The front door was slightly ajar. Odd. He stepped inside. What he saw is the kind of image you never forget. The living room was a scene of chaos. A struggle had unfolded. Furniture overturned, shattered glass across the floor. And then there was Sherri. She lay on the rug, lifeless. Her face bore bruises. Her body showed the brutal marks of fight for survival. 3 gunshot wounds had torn through her chest. Nearby, a broken vase, a quilt wrapped around her, and shards of the couple's belongings scattered across the room. The police would later call it a burglary gone wrong. To them, it looked simple. 2 men had forced their way in, ransacked the house, and when Sherri confronted them, violence erupted. A bloody bite mark on Sherri's forearm suggested she had fought fiercely, clawing and biting at her attackers before they overpowered her. The killers fled, leaving behind nothing but devastation. John fell apart. Friends remembered him as inconsolable, broken in ways words couldn't express. Sherri's parents, Nels and Loretta, were consumed by grief, but also confusion. They knew their daughter. Sherri was cautious, strong, aware. She didn't open the door to strangers. She didn't walk blindly into danger. Something about the burglary gone wrong story didn't sit right. But the detectives pressed forward with their theory. The crime scene evidence seemed to match. Electronics had been moved, jewelry boxes rifled through. A fingerprint, partial smeared, was found. Neighbors reported seeing 2 Latino men in the area. The investigators chalked it up to yet another violent robbery in a city where such crimes were tragically common. And so, Sherri's murder was filed away, another casualty in a wave of unsolved violence sweeping Los Angeles. But here's where the story begins to twist. Because not everyone believed the burglary story. Not Sherri's parents. They remembered conversations Sherri had had in the months before her death. She had confided in them, worried about a woman from John's past. A woman who seemed fixated, jealous. A woman who had once dated John and hadn't taken kindly to being replaced. At the time, detectives brushed off those concerns. But decades later, they would matter more than anyone could have imagined. For now, though, the case went cold. The bloody bite mark, the most personal piece of evidence, was swabbed and stored. DNA testing wasn't advanced enough to unlock its secrets. The murder weapon, a .38 revolver, vanished without a trace. And Sherri Rasmussen's name slowly faded from headlines. Another life lost, another case unsolved. But evil has a way of hiding in plain sight. And sometimes the people we least suspect are the ones who wear the badge. If you're enjoying this story and want more cold cases, mysteries, and shocking true crime investigations, make sure to subscribe. It helps the channel grow and keeps us bringing you these. For years, Sherri Rasmussen's case sat in silence. Files stacked on top of files. Evidence sealed in boxes, locked away in the cold storage rooms of the LAPD. Time moved on. John eventually remarried. Sherri's family tried to piece together shattered lives, and the city of Los Angeles continued to wrestle with waves of crime and violence. But some cases don't stay buried. Some cases whisper, even from the grave. By the early 2000s, technology had changed the world of criminal investigation. DNA analysis was no longer experimental. It was transforming cold cases into solvable puzzles. Across the country, killers who thought they had escaped justice were suddenly being pulled from shadows. In 2004, the LAPD's cold case unit reopened the Rasmussen file. Detectives pulled out photographs, autopsy reports, and that crucial piece of evidence, the bite mark swab from Sherri's arm nearly 2 decades earlier. For the first time, it could be tested against DNA databases. What they discovered was startling. The DNA from the bite mark didn't belong to a man. It belonged to a woman. And just like that, the entire theory of the case shifted. This wasn't the work of 2 burglars. It wasn't a random robbery gone wrong. This was something far more intimate, far more personal. But who? Just before I reveal what investigators discovered next, take a second to subscribe. Trust me, you don't want to miss the twists and turns in stories like this. Detectives scoured records of female offenders. They compared DNA to women in prison, women arrested for violent crimes, women linked to burglaries. Nothing matched. It would take another 2 years and one detective's determination to finally drag the truth into the light. Detective Jim Nuttall and his partner, Pete Barba, were assigned to the case. They started from scratch, poring over every piece of evidence, every interview, every report. And that's when they noticed something buried in the old files, something that had been dismissed at the time, a note about a woman. A woman Sherri had reportedly feared, a woman with ties to John Rutan. Sherri's father had mentioned it back in 1986. His daughter had confided in him about someone who seemed jealous, someone who wouldn't let go of John. The detectives leaned forward. Who was she? They flipped through old witness statements. And then there it was, her name. It stood out like a ghost rising from the past. A woman who wasn't just close to John. A woman who, back in 1986, had been serving as an officer with the Los Angeles Police Department. The detectives exchanged looks. If this theory was true, it meant the prime suspect in one of LA's most brutal cold cases wasn't a nameless burglar, wasn't a faceless criminal lurking in the streets. It was someone who wore the same badge they did, someone who swore to uphold the law. And suddenly, the Rasmussen case wasn't just a cold case anymore. It was a powder keg. Because how do you accuse one of your own? When detectives first whispered her name, the air in the room seemed to shift. Stephanie Lazarus. On paper, she was the kind of officer any department would be proud to have. A long career in the LAPD, respected by her peers, decorated for her work in specialized units. By the late 2000s, she had risen through the ranks to become a detective herself, working in the elite art theft division. But in the Rasmussen files, her name carried a different weight. She wasn't just a cop. She was also John Rutan's ex-girlfriend. And not just any ex-girlfriend. Stephanie had dated John seriously before he met Sherri. By all accounts, she had struggled to let go. Old friends recalled awkward moments. Stephanie showing up at John's apartment unannounced. Stephanie crying, asking for another chance. Even after John and Sherri were married, she hadn't fully disappeared. Sherri's family had noticed it too. Nels Rasmussen remembered his daughter confiding in him, uneasy about a woman from John's past, someone who seemed unable or unwilling to move on. Back in 1986, this had been dismissed as jealousy, a minor footnote. After all, Stephanie was a police officer. Surely she couldn't be a suspect. Surely not. But now, decades later, the DNA told a different story. The bite mark proved that Sherri's killer was a woman. Stephanie Lazarus had motive. She had proximity. She had training with firearms. And she had access to crime scenes. The question was, how do you investigate a fellow cop without tipping her off? Detectives knew they were treading on dangerous ground. If Stephanie caught wind of the investigation, evidence could vanish. Stories could be covered up. Worse, she could run. So they played it carefully. They started watching her. Quietly, discreetly, they studied her movements. They mapped her routines. They built a wall of silence around their work, keeping even other officers in the dark. But the key was DNA. They needed to know if Stephanie's genetic profile matched the sample taken from Sherri's body. To do that, they needed something that belonged to her, something she had touched, something she had discarded. So they followed her into coffee shops, restaurants, public places. And one afternoon, they struck gold. Stephanie finished her drink, tossed the cup in the trash, and walked away. Detectives swooped in. That discarded cup became evidence. When the DNA results came back, the room was silent. The profile matched. After more than 2 decades, the case that everyone thought was unsolvable suddenly had a suspect. Not a burglar, not a stranger, but Detective Stephanie Lazarus of the Los Angeles Police Department. And the question hanging in the air was chilling. How do you arrest a cop for murder? We're getting closer to the shocking truth. But if you haven't already, subscribe now so you'll be the first to hear more unbelievable cases like this one. Once the DNA results came back, the truth was undeniable. The woman who had bitten Sherri Rasmussen in her final moments was Stephanie Lazarus. But proving guilt in the court of public opinion wasn't enough. Detectives needed her words, her reactions, her confessions, something that would hold up under the scrutiny of a trial. And that meant bringing Stephanie in. But how do you arrest a fellow officer? Someone trained in tactics, someone who carries a gun, someone who might sense a trap before it even closes. The LAPD had to be careful, very careful. They came up with a plan. Stephanie was still working in the art theft division, investigating high-value cases. One morning in June 2009, she was called into the office. Nothing unusual, just another day at work. She was told some detectives needed her help on a case. She didn't suspect a thing. Stephanie followed them down to a small interview room in the same building. No windows, neutral walls, just a table and a few chairs. She probably thought it was routine. Another consult, another chance to show her expertise. But the detectives had wired the room for recording. The plan wasn't to outright accuse her, not at first. Instead, they would ease her into it, test her reactions, see how she responded when the past came knocking. They started with small talk, casual questions, and then, like a scalpel slicing into flesh, they went straight to 1986. Do you remember Sherri Rasmussen? The air shifted. Stephanie laughed nervously. She tried to brush it off, said it was a long time ago. She admitted she had dated John, yes. She admitted she'd known Sherri, but she downplayed it, said they weren't close. But the detectives pressed on. They mentioned the murder, the bite mark, the evidence. Slowly, Stephanie's demeanor changed. Her answers grew sharper, more defensive. She leaned back, crossed her arms, as if putting up a wall. Finally, her mask cracked. I mean, if you're accusing me of this, I didn't do this. I didn't murder anyone. I mean, come on, we're friends here, right? But the detectives weren't her friends anymore. They had what they needed. Stephanie Lazarus was placed under arrest for the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. And in that moment, the cop became the suspect. Her badge, her weapon, her career, all stripped away in a heartbeat. The officers who once called her partner now let her out in handcuffs. After 23 years, the secret she thought was buried had risen to the surface. But the story wasn't over, because now the world would learn just how deep the obsession ran. And in a courtroom years later, Stephanie Lazarus would face the consequences of crime she thought she had gotten away with forever. Stephanie Lazarus once wore the LAPD uniform with pride. She carried a gun. She carried authority. She carried trust. But now, she carried shackles. The trial of Stephanie Lazarus began in 2012, nearly 3 years after her arrest. By then, the story had spread like wildfire. A veteran LAPD detective accused of murdering her ex-boyfriend's wife in cold blood, then walking free for decades, even as she worked cases, testified in court, and enforced the very laws she had broken. The courtroom was packed, reporters, true crime enthusiasts, family members of both sides. Everyone wanted to see the fall of the policewoman who had lived a double life. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted a picture of a woman consumed by jealousy, someone who could not let go of the man she believed was hers. They showed the jury photographs of Sherri Rasmussen's body, the brutal beating, the defensive wounds, the bite mark. They explained how the DNA evidence, technology unavailable in the 1980s, had finally identified the killer. They replayed Stephanie's interrogation tapes, letting the jury hear her nervous laughter, her denials, her defensiveness. And then they revealed the gun, not the weapon used in the murder, but Stephanie's own personal firearm, the one she had purchased just weeks before Sherri was killed, a gun that conveniently went missing soon after murder. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. But Stephanie's defense had a job to do. They argued that the case was circumstantial, that the DNA could have been contaminated, that the LAPD had tunnel vision after reopening a cold case decades later. They tried to cast doubt, but the jury wasn't buying it. On March 8, 2012, the verdict was read. We, the jury, in the above-entitled action, find the defendant, Stephanie Lazarus, guilty of the crime of first-degree murder. The room went silent, except for the soft gasps from the gallery. Stephanie Lazarus, once a respected detective, once a protector of the law, was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. Her reaction? stoic, cold, as though the reality hadn't fully sunk in. For Sherri's family, justice had finally arrived. They had waited 26 years to hear those words. For John, Sherri's widower, it was a painful reminder of how his wife had been ripped from him and how the person responsible had been so close all along. And for the LAPD, it was a scar, a reminder that evil can hide even behind a badge, that justice delayed is not always justice denied, but it comes with a price. Stephanie Lazarus is still behind bars today, a detective who once solved cases, now forever remembered as the center of one. The story of Sherri Rasmussen's murder is more than just a tale of obsession, jealousy, and betrayal. It is a story about persistence, how truth can remain buried for decades, but eventually it finds its way to the surface. And in the end, the past always catches up. Always. The murder of Sherri Rasmussen and the eventual conviction of Stephanie Lazarus leaves behind more than just a tragic love story gone wrong. It leaves us with lessons about justice, trust, and the dangers of obsession. First, it reminds us that jealousy is a silent poison. What began as an old relationship that should have been left in the past became a destructive force. Stephanie Lazarus' inability to let go, to accept that John had moved on, turned her into someone capable of the unthinkable. Obsession can twist even the most trusted individuals into strangers we no longer recognize. Second, it shows us the importance of persistence in justice. For 26 years, Sherri's family lived without answers, while the truth sat locked inside an evidence box. It took advances in science, determined detectives, and a refusal to let the case remain cold to finally deliver justice. Sometimes justice moves slowly, but this case proves that truth has a way of resurfacing even decades later. Third, it forces us to reflect on the responsibility of institutions. Stephanie Lazarus wasn't just anyone. She was a police detective, someone entrusted with protecting the public. The fact that she wore the badge while harboring such a dark secret is a reminder that accountability must exist, even within the walls of authority. Justice cannot play favorites, and no one, no matter their title, is above the law. Finally, there is a lesson of healing and closure. For John and for Sherri's family, nothing could ever undo the pain of losing her. But hearing the truth, seeing the person responsible held accountable, brought them a measure of peace. It reminds us that closure isn't about erasing the past. It's about finally knowing the truth. In the end, the story of Stephanie Lazarus isn't just about a murder solved after decades. It's a cautionary tale about the danger of unchecked emotions, the importance of forensic science, and the resilience of those who refuse to give up seeking justice. Because while lies may last for years, even decades, truth endures forever. If this case kept you on the edge of your seat, go ahead and subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who loves true crime. More chilling cases are coming your way.